Chapter 10. And so Allan resigned himself to staying put for another winter. While he never went any further from his upside-down vessel than the nearby ice mountain, and the Ann Forbes stayed locked in the solid ice, this did not mean that Allan's home remained in the same spot all the time. The ice was always moving, and indeed, on the coldest day of winter, when the temperature might drop to 50 below zero, a channel of open water could suddenly appear. This happened when the ice was caught underneath by a strongly flowing current of water driving in one direction, while above a high wind pushed the exposed ice in the opposite direction. The ice might then be split in two by a channel of open water, with clouds of white, steamy smoke hanging over the break in the ice. These open lanes usually froze over again rather quickly, whenever the wind died down or the sea current slacked off. Not only did Allan's iceberg move at its own pace through the surrounding ice, but whole fields of ice were constantly on the move, sometimes crashing into each other or against the ice cliffs that marked the shores of solid land. Nor was the ice always smooth and level. The constant driving of wind and ocean currents forced it into jumbled masses of ice boulders, of ice ridges and ice valleys, and it was often very difficult indeed to make any progress over the frozen sea. For that reason, Allan did not consider leaving the Ann Forbes during the winter months. He would wait for that time between the arrival of daylight again in February and the breakup of the sea ice in late June or early July. That would be the best time to try and reach land. There would be some daylight to travel by, the ice would still be frozen enough to hike over, and he should reach land just about when the whaling ships would be showing up on their annual run. In the meantime, he tried to fill the long hours of constant darkness as best he could. He often thought of home, of his sisters and mother, and especially of his girlfriend Nancy. In a curious way, it was because of Nancy that he found himself in his present situation. All he could have hoped to be at Craigie's after working for 10 or 15 years was a tailor, and that did not satisfy him, for he had fallen deeply in love with Nancy and planned to marry her, and he wanted to offer her a better future than just being the wife of an ordinary tailor. So he looked around for a job with more promising prospects. And because his way home took him down to the harbor, he began to make friends with some of the lads who worked the fishing boats. One day he heard that Master Ian McLeod needed a crew hand. A week later he was getting his sea legs on the herring trawler, Queen of Argyle. The fishing work was cold and dirty, the hours were long, but he made more than twice as much as he made at Craigie's. And if he smelled of fish most of the time, at least it was clean, healthy outdoor work, whereas tailors, who worked indoors all the time, squatting over their cloth, were notorious for dying from tuberculosis, the tailor's disease. Although most of his money went to his mother to help out at home, he always had a little left over to drop in at the drapery shop and spend half an hour buying a length of ribbon or a swatch of velvet for one of his sisters. And naturally, he always waited for Nancy to serve him. In fact, he bought so many penny pieces of velvet for his mother and sisters that the other girls in McLean's drapery shop used to jokingly call out to Nancy every time he showed up, "Here comes your velvet lad." His courtship of Nancy went from silent admiration when they both swept their sidewalks at the same time, through shy conversations when he made his penny purchases in the shop, to Sunday walks on Union Street with her by his side. He found out that Nancy had been born in Edinburgh and moved to Aberdeen when she was a child. Like Allan, she was fatherless, though she had many aunts and uncles. As it turned out, Master Duff was a friend of her family too. Aberdeen was a small seaport, and nearly everyone knew everyone else. And one day, while sitting on the harbor seawall, she confessed to Allan with many giggles that Master Duff warned her to stay away from that Gordon lad. Imitating the master's frown and pinched expression, she said, "Have nothing to do with him. Nothing but the wind whistling in one ear and out the other ever disturbs anything inside that great empty barn he carts around on top of his shoulders." and when she told him, he felt a fierce anger and made a promise to himself that one day he would prove the master wrong and set the whole town of Aberdeen on its ear with a tale that would leave everyone talking about him for years. In the meantime, he had better stop daydreaming and see about getting something to eat for himself and his hungry pet. After his meal, he reluctantly decided to brave the freezing cold outside and pay the ice mountain a visit. Although there was now constant near darkness with the sun no longer visible, there were still occasional days and nights of cloudless weather with clear, bright moonlight. During these moonlit periods, Allan often went to his cave at the top of the iceberg to see if he could spot any land. He still kept the ice cave supplied all through the winter with frozen meat, with coal and extra clothes. While the Ann Forbes was in little danger from ordinary pack ice, Allan never knew when another iceberg, driven by the wind, might crash through the sea ice and into his vessel. He had spotted hundreds of these bergs, both in open water and trapped in the ice. If anything did happen to the Ann Forbes, he wanted to be able to take refuge in his iceberg home. He loaded his fowling piece and called to Nancy. The full moon, reflecting off the snow and ice, made it almost as bright as normal daylight. When Allan finally reached the top of his ice peak, he was in for a pleasant surprise. The air was still and without a hint of any wind. The extraordinary brightness of the moonlight, together with the stillness of the air, combined to offer greater winter visibility than he had ever seen before. In fact, off about 20 miles or so to the east, there appeared a high, jagged ridge on the horizon line. Allan was almost sure that the ridge was the ice-covered cliff of some body of land. Of course, the promise of land that far away meant little to Allan. By now he was well aware that his ice island, or rather the whole ice field, could drift miles away from the land in a day or two. And of course winter, with its scarcity of game, was no time to strike out for a place that, even if he reached it, could prove far more dangerous than his ice island. At least where he was, he had a good supply of food. While Allan was looking around the horizon, marveling how bright and peaceful and still everything was, the silence was ripped apart by the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. Indeed, some of the sounds that the ice made when it was under pressure from the sea or the wind resembled the firing of a gun, but on this particular occasion the air was so still, there was so little noise of any kind from the ice, that Allan decided the report he heard could well be a gunshot. He lifted his own fowling piece and fired. For a minute he waited, his heart in his mouth. If there was anyone out there, they should hear his signal and answer him. Crack! Again the report came. With trembling fingers, Allan spilled powder onto the pan of his fowling piece. He would try one more shot to make sure. He touched off another round, and this time, when his shot was answered, he was able to make a rough guess where the sound was coming from. Someone was out there on the ice field, about halfway between the iceberg and the ridge of land, some 20 miles away. And Allan knew there was no time to be lost if he was to find whoever else was out there on the frozen ice. His first thought was that another whaling ship had been trapped for the winter, and a hunting party of the crew had been sent out on the sea ice to try and shoot some polar bears for meat. Working as fast as he could in the sub-zero cold, he filled his lamp with whale oil and set it on the observation platform. It would burn for hours and was not likely to go out in the still, windless air. In case he had to return to the iceberg, and missing his outgoing tracks, he would have a light to guide him back. For Allan intended to find whoever was out there on the ice. He hurried down to the Ann Forbes and woke up Nancy, who had been sleeping for the past 2 days. "Come on, girl, that's a good lassie," he urged, blowing tobacco smoke into her face. As usual, when Nancy woke from a deep sleep, it took her a little while to become fully conscious. In between nagging and nudging his pet, Allan stocked up on extra gunpowder and shot, packed knapsacks full of food for himself and Nancy, and took along a full bottle of rum. He finally got Nancy to her feet and the knapsack tied to her back. Urging his pet in front of him, he left the Ann Forbes. Then he sealed shut the cabin window from the outside with blocks of snow that he packed into the opening. When he had gone about a dozen paces, he stopped and turned around for a last look. The black belly of the Ann Forbes seemed to lie on the ice like the carcass of a stranded whale. "Well, Nancy, I pray that's the last we'll ever see of the ice prison that has held us for the past year. Now, in God's name, let us go forward and find whoever is out there." Although it was very cold, there was almost no wind, which meant that leads of water were not likely to open up and block his way, or force him to make a long detour. Walking in what he judged to be the right direction, he paused every once in a while to carefully search the frozen seas for any signs of life. He walked for hours in the moonlight, until he guessed that he had covered something like 10 or 12 miles. And although he often stopped and listened for the sound of voices, for the barking of dogs, for another gunshot, he heard nothing. The land he had earlier seen from the iceberg was getting closer and closer. At one point, when Allan stopped to rest for a moment, Nancy left him and went ranging far off to his right. He was tempted to call her back, but decided against it. In fact, he thought, it might not be a bad idea to follow her. Perhaps she might lead him to something. And half an hour later she did. He caught up with her and found her halted at the tracks of men and dogs and sleds, obviously a large hunting party of Eskimos. They could not be stranded whalers, Allan decided, or they would not have dogs and sleds with them. Allan carefully examined the tracks. The party had halted for a while, perhaps for a rest or to have something to eat. There were boot tracks all over, and in several places yellow patches on the ice from dog urine. It took him a little while of tracking around, going ahead and going back, but he finally figured out that the sleds were heading for land, not back out onto the sea ice. "Come on, Nancy," he cried out. "We'll soon be with friends." He felt a great burst of hope. All he had to do was follow the tracks until he caught up with the sleds. Then his long imprisonment would be over. The land was now only 3 or 4 miles away, and surely the party would stop to rest for a while when they reached the shore. With any luck, he might spot the sleds and dogs somewhere ahead of him. Nancy again left him, running on and following the tracks. For a while, Allan tried to keep up with her. He was afraid that she would overtake the strangers and that they would shoot her on sight, not knowing that she was a tame bear. But Allan was now getting tired and was forced to halt for another rest. He squinted his eyes, trying to pick out Nancy ahead of him. What he saw made him close his eyes and shake his head. Now he could see 2 Nancys, standing up in front of the tumbled ridge of ice boulders that marked the shore of the land. Once again he closed his eyes, wondering if his eyesight was playing tricks on him. He looked again, and this time made out at least 4 polar bears in a band. He watched them and noticed that they were now all standing up and looking in his direction. He squatted down and remained still for minutes, hoping the bears would think he was just a block of ice. But polar bears have an excellent sense of smell. A rotting seal or whale carcass, for example, will draw them from many miles around. As soon as the bears caught Allan's scent, they dropped all 4s and came charging out in a wave to meet him. When Allan saw them coming, he jumped to his feet, turned around, and ran for his life.